Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the Trump administration's moves against Columbia University and student protesters, Donald Trump's test drive of a Tesla, and RFK's lunch at the Midwestern chain Steak and Shake. I'm joined by Jeff Schellenberger and Ashley Frawley, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. The Trump administration has canceled $400 million in funding to Columbia University. These are grants and contracts, most of which go to support the medical and scientific research conducted at Columbia. But the cancellation has to do with the campus protests that broke out there in the wake of the October 7 attack on Israel. The Trump administration has justified its move by referencing the prevalence of anti-Semitism on campus, something that drew criticisms from some faculty, alumni, and students. They've also arrested Mahmoud Khalil, a leader of the student protests, a foreign national married to an American who was 8 months pregnant with his child. It's a remarkable campaign against Columbia. It seems very clear that the Trump administration has decided to make this university the example in its campaign against academia more broadly. It is using the apparatus of civil rights law to threaten action against these universities for engaging in forms of discrimination, for effectively creating a hostile environment for students of a certain type. And it has fixed on the issue of anti-Semitism, I think, because it's an issue that so perfectly divides the academic community itself, pitting more centrist liberals against a more activist left. And it's an issue on which those centrist liberals who often feel themselves to be, the ones in need of some lecture or some kind of moral correction or improvement from the left, they often see themselves as operating in this more compromised moral role. It's an issue on which they feel real moral zeal and on which they're prepared to fight. So it's, I think, a very well-chosen wedge issue in terms of dividing the academic coalition and maybe forcing some larger change in academia more broadly. But I think with the arrest of Khalil, certainly there's a lot of outrage. Some more centrist figures are remaining silent. I think Andrew Cuomo, who's running for mayor of New York, hasn't commented on it. An indication that he feels some cross pressure. But I still think that you're seeing a certain kind of reconsolidation of the academic kind of left liberal community against Trump on this issue with the arrest of this young man.
I was going to remark, because you brought up Cuomo, that current New York City mayor and possible contender in the upcoming election to remain in office, Eric Adams, remarked on this that he was shocked to see how many people were standing up for Khalil who had not stood up for him. So, this anyway, that's not a particularly important point, but it was kind of an amazing moment. But
when Adams was himself accused of alignment with a foreign power.
Yes, right.
In that case, Turkey instead of Hamas.
Exactly.
Right. And I think it was just taking free flights and not seeming to indicate sympathy for designated terrorist organization.
Yeah, and yet, who of these people stood up for Eric Adams. In any case, yeah, so a few thoughts on this. One, clearly, if we think about the many debates about campus politics over the past decade, one of the terms that came up over and over again was safetyism, right? And the idea that this demand for safety, and particularly safety for protected groups, perceived as vulnerable, was of paramount importance, and that therefore all kinds of other values, including free speech, academic freedom, and so on, could be sort of downgraded or suspended in the name of safety. And so, it seems to me indisputable that the right has fully embraced this logic. I argued that this was the case already in the hearings with university presidents last year, where the implication was that a particular protected group's safety was the most important criterion, and that the college presidents were being indicted for not creating a safe environment. And so, it seems clear to me that, there are various things you could compare this withdrawal of funding to. One would be the Dear Colleague letter from the Obama administration that initiated the ratcheting up of Title IX proceedings that, really kind of prompted the increased profile of sort of campus sexual assault allegations. And, the similarity is simply that you have this civil rights law, which designates certain protected groups. And then you have the government essentially threatening to, or in this case, actually, retracting funding in the name of ensuring that these groups that these groups' safety is guaranteed. And so, it seems very clear to me, and just again indisputable, that this is just a continuation of the same logic, but it's been kind of switched around in terms of which groups are regarded as which group's safety is regarded as paramount. And I think I will take a slight victory lap here, because when I reviewed the slew of anti-woke books that came out around 2023, I argued that, most of the logics that we'd seen operative over the prior decade would continue, even if the particular coalition that had been directing and sort of pushing those logics in certain directions, or giving them certain giving certain groups priority, fell out of power, and the right came into power, that the basic logic would remain the same. And that, I think, is exactly what we're seeing now. And then, the other thing which is notable here, I think, is there are a few, in terms of the Khalil situation, there is sort of an intersection of free speech questions with questions about immigration, and essentially the executive branch's power to remove foreign nationals from the country, and to what extent that's constrained. And so, it seems to me that is, an intersection of two kind of, aspects of this administration, one of which is that it does want to assert a stronger power on the part of the authorities to, designate certain foreign nationals for removal on various grounds, and to expedite that process. But then that you also have this intersecting with the free speech case, which I think is important, because if you look at the history of debates over free speech you see people on the right sort of saying things like, well, the First Amendment only applies to U.S. citizens, which isn't really true. There's quite a bit of of jurisprudence around this. There are various respects in which that isn't true. But it's kind of how a sort of conservative coalition that has defined itself as free speech absolutist, and ironically, has its home is on one hand has you have prominent Republican politicians saying things like, there is no space for anti-Semitism in the United States of America and things like this. Well, I mean, that's kind of an absurd claim if you're a free speech absolutist, or even have like a basic conviction in the validity of the First Amendment. But it's also particularly absurd when you just scroll through your X feed and find, I was thinking the other day, like the current iteration of X is probably the largest outlet. I mean, I'm almost certain it's the largest outlet in terms of sheer quantity of anti-Semitic propaganda in the history of the world. I mean, I've never, since Elon Musk took over X, I've never seen so much straight up kind of classic sort of Der Stürmer style anti-Semitic content in my life. So it's ironic for a political coalition that is, so deeply embedded with this particular platform and intertwined with the interests of its owner to be saying these things about, foreign nationals don't have First Amendment rights, and anti-Semitism has no place in the United States. When if you want to find straight up anti-Semitism, just log into X and do a brief scroll, and you will find a lot of it. So, and to be clear, we don't know whether the people posting that are Americans or foreigners. And I mean, this, the internet sort of creates all sorts of issues, although these issues have been legislated in terms of, in the Cold War, whether people could obtain, Soviet publications. Like there were lawsuits about this type of thing. But, my point here is simply that, there's this sudden assertion of all of these limitations and restrictions that, from the same camp that, even if you slightly pivot the discussion today, will say, well, of course, X is this wonderful free speech haven where everything goes. And if you point out that it's just a kind of fire hose of anti-Semitism 24/7, then that will be presented to you as just sort of, well, that's just what the First Amendment means. And then if you slightly pivot the discussion, it's, well, the First Amendment only applies to U.S. nationals. So it's a very bizarre situation. I just will go back to my own recent writing on this. This is the Bizarro awakening, and all the logics that we saw under the previous hegemony are continued, and we've just reached a very strange and radically self-contradictory configuration of the culture.
Just in terms of one of those kind of anti-Semitic things I saw on Twitter in recent days, concerning this case, some on a kind of hard right take it as an indication of how thoroughly controlled by world Jewry, the GOP, is that they're making this anti-Semitism their big case. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that's a reflection of a misunderstanding of what the real logic is here. Anti-Semitism is the most useful way to split apart a certain political coalition that otherwise gets along very well. And whatever cause this more anti-Semitic right might want the Trump administration to pick up, if they want the Trump administration to go after Colombia for failing to admit enough NASCAR fans from Red America, I don't see many Jeff Gordon flags flying in Harvard Yard. That's not going to be an effective way to fracture this coalition. So I just mentioned that in passing to kind of push back on one little bit of what you're mentioning. I feel as a member of that right wing coalition, I feel relatively kind of unimplicated by these contradictions because I've never been a free speech absolutist as such. But I do still have worries about the potential chilling effect of these things. When I see uh, a statement like, so and so is aligned, his statements are aligned with Hamas. Or no, actually, they said aligned to Hamas. This was the phrasing they used. I thought that was odd English, but aligned to Hamas. Well, I'm a social conservative. I'm a Christian. There has been, uh, vigilance from the FBI. They've looked at Latin Mass Catholics, said are these domestic subversives of some kind. Some Christian conservatives have expressed sympathy for Putin's Russia, and there are attempts on the parts of American progressives to tie Christianity and conservatism as a whole to foreign powers, to present these people as un-American. So I think the notion that you can be aligned to a foreign regime, just on the basis of what you say, is an alarming one. Now, evidence may come out showing that, in Khalil's case, it went far beyond that. There was real involvement of some kind. But right now, the case, as we've seen it, I think is somewhat disturbing and somewhat chilling. And though I'm not a free speech absolutist, I do treasure our culture of vigorous debate and think that the First Amendment is, invaluable as a constitutional guarantee and should be defended where it can be. Just because, though these things can never be taken to the absolute limits, it's consistent with a culture of freedom to allow people to speak freely. It's a way of saying every man enjoys what in other societies are just the privileges of a very select few. And that's consistent with a democratic and Republican culture. So that's something we want, even though there are always going to have to be limits on it. So, yeah, I do have some concerns about this case, even though I'm not a free speech absolutist, even though there are distinctions, obviously, between a citizen and a non-citizen, but without getting into the kind of language of what powers the Secretary of State has to reject visa applications or stop the naturalization processes of people for foreign policy reasons. Without entering into that, I do think we should remain very jealous, not just of our kind of formal liberties, but of the culture that gives them force. In terms of the Trump administration, kind of creating a new safetyism, a new sensitivity culture. I listened recently to Christopher Rufo's interview with the New York Times columnist Ross Douthat. Highly recommend the conversation. And what the two of them talked about was this really remarkable moment where the right is embracing the Civil Rights Act in a new way. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the right wanting to repeal the Civil Rights Act. There's been alarm about that. People have talked about it. The opposite is what's happening now. The right is not repealing the Civil Rights Act. The right is taking it up and using it to scrutinize actions that they regard as discriminatory. And this is really, really invasive. You're having a conversation between Douthat and Rufo about, okay, how many more Asians would have to be admitted to Cal Berkeley or MIT to prove that they are, no longer discriminating as they were before students for fair admission, v. Harvard. Which government bureaucrat makes that determination? What does the exact number need to be? And posing the question like that shows how kind of absurd and pettifogging these regimes can be. But also, this is just how civil rights law operates and always has. I mean, this is exactly what's been going on in American life for many years. Jamelle Bouie, another Times writer, as it happens, was tweeting about this in February, and was talking about how under the Trump administration, if even if you don't have a DEI program, could having a workforce that's too diverse be taken as a sign of discrimination, or reverse discrimination against whites, to use an older term? That's a really, really good question. It's also the kind of question that people have been asking themselves for a long time with civil rights law. I mean, those questions have always been operative. They've always been informing these practices. And what I think we've seen for many decades is that because pressure was being applied from one side of the political spectrum, it was relatively safe to move, cautiously and sensibly, but to continue to move in a certain direction. Just as long as you get more and more people from more and more underrepresented minorities of a certain type, that's the best way to indicate that you're in the clear. Now that the right is applying pressure from the opposite direction, I guess it does seriously complicate it, in that you now have to calibrate from both angles. You have to say, well, I can't go too far this way, I can't go too far that way. I don't want to be discriminating against an underrepresented minority. I also don't want to be discriminating against people who are members of an overrepresented minority or of a historic majority, or I don't want it to be creating a hostile environment for Palestinians, but also not for Jews. So how am I going to balance all this? It is newly complicated, but also it's very much in continuity with what we've seen before. And I think that the real story is this: the right is embracing and really making its own the machinery of civil rights.
Mm-hmm. It's been very interesting watching people for the last few weeks, watching the left use the language of the right and the right use the language of the left. So just over the past couple of days, I've seen supposed leftists champion bankers. We need the prudence of the banks, and championing, Mark Carney, of all people, which we'll come to. And then the right using the language of the left, which is, protecting a particular group, and all of the same arguments that we saw. And I, too, would like to do a victory lap, because I definitely, I warned people, when you use this against your opponents, it's going to be used against you. I guarantee it. This sort of like naked power approach to getting what you want is eventually, when your opponents come to power, they're going to crush you. If you use everything in your arsenal to crush your opponents, they will do the exact same thing. And that's what they were, through the language of like protection and so on, they were essentially furthering an agenda that they wanted. The reason why they cared so much about protecting the vulnerable is like, well, protecting trans people. Why? Because that was an ideology that they agreed with. Okay, so now we have it turned around. This is obvious. But you mentioned you're not a free speech absolutist. I am a free speech absolutist. I recognize.
Silence! You will not voice these opinions here.
But what I found very interesting about this case is that officials seem to be going on this sort of providing material support for a terrorist organization, which seems to me, it sounds like they're reaching for something, anything. That, the material support for thing seems like, well, has a connection that's a little bit closer to Hamas than simply speech. But then it might be, and we don't know yet, as you said, but it might be that they're going for, and it kind of came out in Rubio's speech, was a lesser use stipulation that people can have their green cards or visa revoked for acting against the foreign policy of the United States. Now, that's interesting that that's even on the books. And that's a slide that's a hangover, as far as I'm aware, from the war on terror and all this sort of thing, because it is yet another one of those cases where an extreme situation is used as a reason to revoke rights. And people people who love to say, oh, you're free to do whatever you want, but you're not free to claim fire in a crowded theater. They are also, when they say that, they're also evoking U.S. foreign policy interests to shut down speech, because that phrase, I'm not sure how well aware everyone is of this. I might just be telling you something that's very obvious, but that phrase was obviously used during the First World War against a socialist, the secretary of the Socialist Party. Charles Schenck, who had been distributing leaflets against conscription after the passing of the Conscription Act, saying, well, we have to fight for our rights. But this is what the pamphlet said, which is hardly like the most incendiary thing ever. And the judge in that case against him, he was arrested, and he said, no, I have the freedom of speech to say this. And the judge said there is no freedom to shout fire in a crowded theater. Because what was the crowded theater? It was the United States at war. So you're not free to say anything that would hurt the United States' foreign interests. That was it. And that judge walked it back, I will have you know, and recognized that it was a mistake to have said that, and actually defended right into the 1920s freedom of speech, and realized that was, first of all, when people say that, when they trot out that quote, they mangle it and say it incorrectly. It was falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater, but it doesn't matter. The point is that this is using war as an excuse to revoke rights, or using foreign policy as an excuse to revoke rights. And this was something that was actually walked back. So this is something that nobody should ever have defended. But you saw everybody defending this. Aha, now we have the chickens have come home to roost. It's going to be used against you. And this is why I'm fairly absolutist when it comes to free speech. Because when you start making exceptions, you start opening the door for more and more and more. And everybody wants to shut up their opponents. I never understand when people say, okay, we have free speech, but you don't have the freedom to say this and that. What did you think? Or you don't have the freedom to be offensive. This was an actual trade unionist in the UK said, you don't have freedom of speech is not the freedom to be offensive. What the heck is freedom of speech then? Do you think the people who fought for freedom of speech did it to talk about daisies, and cookies and tea? No, obviously freedom of speech is to say offensive things. That's the whole point, is to say things that people don't want you to say, right? And you also, by opening the door to more and more, but except for this and except for that, you undermine the basis of liberal democracy, which is that people are capable of reflecting on speech and choosing how to respond. Now, we might disagree with the way that they respond. They may respond very badly, but they are free to do that. And if you say they are not, if you say that people are like, Pavlovian dogs who salivate at the sound of a bell, you are undermining the entire edifice of our society that's built on top of that. So that's why we have that freedom of speech, because you recognize that in our society, we think that people are capable of reflecting and choosing how to respond. So all of these restrictions are very, very, very dangerous territory. And we walked ourselves into it. I hesitate to put myself on that side, but the so-called progressive left walked right into that. Surprise, surprise. Exactly what we said would happen is happening.
One thing I want to highlight here is the fact that universities are medieval institutions. That's their origin. It's one of the oldest kind of institutional forms we have in the world, in any civilization. And they have their origin in the training of clergy for the Catholic Church. That's what your university student would have been back during the origin of the institution. And clergy had various legal privileges and immunities. They were to be tried basically by separate church courts rather than by a secular power, because they were under the jurisdiction of this body that claimed a kind of independence from the state, right? And that is really the origin of something you still see today in American life, which is that often, especially at these elite schools, this doesn't really hold at your junior college in Kansas or what have you. But at these elite schools especially, there are private police forces. There are forms of behavior that would be harshly, that would be felonies anywhere else that are treated, you really get off with a warning almost, or, things like this. And that there's just a very long history of conflicts between town and gown, effectively, over this kind of thing. And universities are jealous of their privileges. Universities are increasingly important and powerful institutions, relatively speaking, in American life, as their endowments pile up. Meanwhile, other schools are closing and failing, and adjuncts aren't being paid. But the largest universities are more powerful than ever. And I do think one thing that's going on here with the case of Khalil and the Trump administration's general move against the protest movement at Columbia is an attack on those privileges of the university, which are very ancient. And if you look at why Columbia became such a source of campus unrest, it has to do with the fact, obviously, it was the home of Edward Said. There's a sizable contingent of faculty that is very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. And, as has been reported, those faculty members are very active in faculty governance and in important committees. And they have made a concerted push, emphatically within their rights as members of the faculty, to ensure that there aren't harsh disciplinary measures meted out against these protesters, and to make sure that there's a maximally wide space for confrontational action by them. And again, the faculty has, gets to decide who goes on the committees. The people who are sympathetic to the protests have, been more committed to this political process than your whatever Israeli biologist or chemist or something who's working at the medical school. And so they've left a large space for campus activism. And the Trump administration is stepping in and saying, you really need to tighten that space. It's saying, this determination made by your institution and by its faculty is wrong, and we're not going to allow it. So it's interesting in that way, in that it kind of reprises almost, the old pattern of church-state conflict, of a kind of the state saying, look, you have too many privileges and immunities, you're abusing them, and we're going to put you on a tighter leash.
People can go back to Greg Conti's piece on university reform in 19th century Britain, which offers an interesting sort of historical precedent for some of what you're talking about, Matthew. He's pointing out, one interesting thing is that, really it was the kind of liberal and progressive cause to, in a sense, weaken the privileges and protections of universities. And he wrote about this in relation to endowments as well, right? That these protections were seen as sort of allowing universities to retain this sort of reactionary culture that was out of touch with the rest of a kind of, rapidly changing and progressing society. And so it really was a sort of liberal crusade in the 19th century to sort of open up the universities and remove some of, the procedural constraints that allowed them to sort of insulate themselves from popular pressures. And so anyway, Greg's two pieces on endowments and university reform in the 19th century from a couple months ago are both worth revisiting in this regard.
Yeah, I do think, my own view is that there should be clear time, place, and manner restrictions on speech, and that you should not be allowed to disrupt the operation of the university. I draw, the distinction between, a sit-in at a segregated lunch counter where you're directly defying an unjust law, and when you're just shutting down, making the Columbia Library inaccessible is, not much less directly connected to the injustice, the claimed injustice that you're protesting. And so I think that's what should be done. But I do think that one of the things that's at play in this discussion is this sense held by a lot of people that if you're a student at Columbia, you should be able to participate in this kind of wild free speech type culture. And maybe it has its ironies. It maybe limits the speech of some people, but this culture of protest and demonstration, you should basically just be free to participate in it insofar as the university permits that culture. And if it's made a determination that you shouldn't be expelled, that they don't want to press charges against you for vandalism that's occurred in one of their buildings or what have you, then that should settle it in a way that the highest court. and these more secular authorities should just defer to their determinations. I think there's something kind of traditional in that impulse, but there's also a very long history of contestation between universities and surrounding political communities, and I think what we're seeing here is that American universities are out of step with a large portion of the American populace. They've just failed to bring in people who are more conservative, as Jacob Schell wrote about for us, and they've failed to reckon with the opinions of roughly half of the country, and that's leading to some pretty intense conflict now.
Well, look, as much as I can't stand Hamas protesters, and I can't stand anything to do with Hamas, and I think everyone's being incredibly stupid, I will defend them. It's that old cliche. I will defend to the death their right to do so, because you have to defend your enemies.
Yeah, Ashley, you wrote about the pro-Hamas left and called it the new progressive nihilism in the wake of October 7th. So you can claim a genuine, you can rightly claim antipathy for these people even as you defend them. You have demonstrated it.
Yeah, and that's the most obvious thing to me. Like, as a 16-year-old kid, it's like the first thing you learn when you do a debate in high school, right? Are you not learning this stuff? Do you not care? Like, that's our litmus test. Obviously, you hate to do it, but you got to do it. And everybody's been like bending over backwards to make up reasons why their enemies shouldn't be allowed to speak. I hate these people. I think they're idiots. I still think they need to be free to protest, much as it causes, all sorts of problems. Okay, well, use your speech to counter.
Speaking of deep divides, I do want to talk now about the conflict between Canada and the United States, a conflict that splits this podcast in two, with Ashley representing the Maple Leaves and Jeff and me, as the tariff maxing
plunderers,
Americans. In a further act of aggression, I failed to tease at the beginning of the episode that we would be talking a bit about Canada, which just shows the kind of pride and inconsiderateness of the Americans. But it's been announced Mark Carney is succeeding Justin Trudeau as leader of the Liberal Party and as Prime Minister of Canada. What are his qualifications for office?
Well, he's got a long history in the banking system. He was also the head of the central bank in the UK, I think, and is not elected. So he's actually the perfect leader. He's the ideal leader. He's exactly what you want. And he's managed to get, he's been in important positions during previous economic crises, which set alarm bells off for me, because I have long said, like a broken record, that we are headed for a massive crisis, that we've been kicking the can down the road since 2008, because nobody wants, obviously, an economic crisis. So they're doing all sorts of creative things. And I do think that a lot of the, I think that Fabio Vighi is right to a certain extent about COVID having an element of controlled demolition about it. And so, I am highly, highly suspicious of this particular choice. But what I think is very interesting, again, in another case of the left using the talking points of the right, did you see Mark Carney about a month ago on Jon Stewart on The Daily Show? What?
Absolutely not. Why would I tune into that?
Oh my God. So here's the thing. I was like, maybe people still watch this. I used to watch it religiously when I lived in Canada.
It was big when we were a little younger than we are now. No, we're all the same age, I think, but it was big when we were
I know,
younger.
and I'm like, sure, that's like me when I'm lecturing. I'm like, I'll be cool and I'll use a joke from like Dave Chappelle, and everyone's like, who? Oh God. Anyway, so I happen to have seen Mark Carney, a clip of him on The Daily Show, and Jon Stewart just absolutely fawning over him, being like, yeah, of course, we need a banker. Yeah, of course, insurance companies aren't insuring people anymore because of these fires. Like, just totally like, yes, of course, that's quite prudent, very prudent. So it's so interesting that I am curious. Now, we talked a few weeks ago about the global vibe shift, right? I'm starting to wonder, was it really a vibe shift? or was it a momentary regrouping? Because I said at that time, such a powerful form of global governance is not simply going to retreat. That is the governance of the technocratic sort of banker class, this sort of like marriage of post-liberal technocracy and, well, post-liberalism with technocracy, the destruction of liberalism, technocratic governance, managerialism, therapeutic governance, all that stuff. That is such a powerful form of governance. Is it really going to retreat? I don't think so. And I think there has been it was just a tactical retreat that was making a way for a regrouping. And I think that there's a strong argument to be made that populism has mostly served as a pressure valve. And so all this frustration with the technocracy has been expressed. And then it's like the powers that be kind of, okay, you had your fun. And we saw this with Syriza, right? So you had this like groundswell of discontent with the technocrats, right? And Syriza comes to power, and, Varoufakis, for all his sins, describes this really, really well, where he goes to the EU and they look at him like a child. And they're like, all right, buddy, the adults are in the room now. We're going to do the real business. And it's a bit like that, where they're sort of watching this happen. They're like, okay, you've had your fun. Now we'll come in and we'll show you how it's done. So Carney seems like this interesting kind of ideal figure of a new kind of managerialism. I think we are going to see, I think he almost certainly is going to win the next election. So the whole unelected bit will go, because Pierre Poilievre is not, I really don't think he stands a chance, given how much bluster has been coming from Trump. Canadians aren't going to want somebody who's going to roll over for him, and that's what it seems like is going to happen. So
now,
yeah.
help me out here, because I'm so ill-informed on the topic. Is Pierre Poilievre in the same party as Doug Ford, the leader of Ontario, who got in this confrontation with Trump over electricity? Are they in the same party?
Yes, I think that he's like local government. We're talking about, like central government.
Right. I ask because it seems that, Ford is taking a much more confrontational stance toward the U.S. than Poilievre is taking. So, it's interesting that you have a kind of right-wing Canadian figure who is sounding more maybe more nationalist notes than Poilievre is.
Yeah, I'm sort of revealing like how distanced I am now from Canadian politics. Like, I'm not entirely sure. You're talking about Doug Ford, right? So I haven't.
Right.
Yeah, I have not been following it in that much detail. My only sense is that, in terms of the sort of global symbolism that somebody like Carney, what he represents. Yeah, I mean, obviously, also Poilievre has had to take like a different. He's had to take a step back, and he's now making sort of different kinds of sounds in relation to Trump and distancing himself from Trump, obviously. But everybody knows that he stands for that populist spirit, that anti-technocratic spirit. And Carney is a Davos insider. As I said, a central banker. And he is very much a symbol of everything that populism stood against. But interestingly, even Carney is taking this kind of he's giving this sort of managerialism a new face. So he's a little edgy. So, like we had neoliberalism with a human face for a really long time. Now we're going to get sort of neoliberalism with a populist face to a certain extent. That's it. That's like the extent of the vibe shift. It'd be like neoliberalism, but like slightly meaner and without the mask. So he's a banker who talks like a populist. That's essentially it. And I think that's enough for him to win an election. But I think he stands for the fact that technocracy has not lost and it has not given up.
Yeah, I really know nothing about Carney other than just the fact that he ran the Bank of England, and he looks like the ultimate technocrat, just a perfectly groomed, incredibly well maintained, and no doubt very kind of tasteful and considerate man. And there is yeah, it is a strong contrast to the kind of weirdness and realness that Marx, or the kind of weirdness and real fakeness that marks populist politicians, whether it's Geert uh, Wilders, if that's how you say the name, the Dutch populist with the wild bleached blonde hair, or Trump himself, Orange Man, bad. And Jeff, I just want to ask you a bit about two things we saw this week. One, Trump test driving a Tesla, part of the ongoing bromance with Elon Musk, and then RFK's momentous visit to Steak and Shake, that iconic American chain.
Yeah, there's so much to say. These are both kind of iconic moments for the new administration. I think the sort of product placement, kind of retail, literal retail politics aspect of it is fascinating. The way that brands become sort of ideologically marked and politically defined. It's a long way from the era of, I don't know, sort of General Electric and Sears and, these kind of the American corporation as this kind of, neutral space. And, but the other thing that strikes me about these two incidents is that you can sort of tie both of them to this concept of the Californian ideology, which is associated with Silicon Valley, and specifically this fusion of the kind of hippie and the sort of libertarian with this kind of techno-futurist outlook. This is a concept defined by Richard Barbrook and Andy Cameron in a prophetic 1995 essay. And, so both these incidents, I mean, the Tesla most obviously, because we have this brand, which again, until recently was kind of politically defined as, essentially associated. I mean, I spend a good amount of time in Berkeley, California, and there are a lot of Teslas there. So, that pretty much defines it. It's historically been associated with affluent progressives who are very concerned about the environment, right? And so seeing it radically rebranded in this kind of MAGA direction is quite fascinating. There are so many things to say about the aesthetics of that scene. It was, 3 generations. You had Trump, Elon, and, one of Elon's progeny out there, looking at these cars. And it brought me back to going as a teen. My dad was buying a car and I happened to tag along at some point when I was 16 or 17, I guess. And, it was assumed by the car dealers that my dad was buying me a car, right? And it was kind of this iconic American moment where, they really were trying to sell my dad a car that would be for me. And this was actually not the case. My dad just wanted to buy a kind of ordinary, Toyota sedan, and they were trying to kind of, find the cars that would be appealing to a 16-year-old. But anyway, there's something iconic about that moment, this kind of multi-generational scene of men checking out cars. But then, it's odd that as you said, this is a car that's sort of, largely associated with these kind of effete progressive enclaves historically, is associated with obviously the Obama era subsidies that, kind of propelled Tesla's growth in an earlier phase. And, there's something very odd, I'm sort of convinced by this idea that, part of what Musk is doing at the moment has to do with the huge challenge to his model that the Chinese EV industry now poses. And so, Musk is known to be a gambler, and it seems that he knows that his days are numbered as the top EV manufacturer. I mean, they're already over. And so he's really got to do something else. But then there's this kind of odd, attempt to sort of prop up Tesla on political grounds, which happens to be the opposite of the political grounds that initially propelled its success, right? Which was this kind of selling of the green transition to, affluent people with lots of disposable income. Now it's kind of this, or it's, I guess, an attempt to sell these cars to a increasingly downscale coalition of people who have, I mean, I was reminded of like this thing where at some point it became this thing that you would like express your opposition to Obama's green policies, again the very policies that made Tesla what it is, by putting this attachment to your to the back of your car where you just like put some burning coal in the, you know what I'm talking about? There's like this like symbolic protest against Obama's energy where you'd be like, I'm going to burn even more carbon by like putting this little sort of coal barbecue and on the back of your car and driving around with this like smoking pile of coal as a way of expressing your repudiation of the Obama green agenda. So now this
so for
kind
every
of
EV, they'll cut an acre of rainforest or something like that. That'd
right.
be a good selling point.
Yeah. And so anyway, so now to have
it's so great. I miss that version of the right so much. I never thought I would miss.
So the MAGA branding of Tesla is fascinating. So it really is the migration, the kind of weird and very contradictory migration of the Californian ideology rightward, where, the same people who, I don't know, I mean, maybe the same people who put these kind of coal burning attachments to the back of their, to the back of their pickup trucks 10 years ago are now going to, take out a big loan to buy a Tesla just to own, because both serve to own the libs. So, that's really what's going on here.
Yeah, well, Trump is test driving a Tesla. You had in the presidential campaign last fall, Tim Walz, who drives around a fixed up and very spiffy looking International Harvester Scout, kind of the ultimate farmer rancher truck, which is what my grandpa always drove when I was growing up around his farm. So a kind of maybe a kind of reversal there, and maybe we'll see more stuff with Democrats wearing camo hats and driving IH Scouts and Republicans championing Tesla. And Jeff, I got to get you in on this on RFK at Steak and Shake before our time is up.
So RFK.
Why did he visit this august institution?
So apparently because they, as conservative commentator Charlie Kirk put it, bravely fry all their food in tallow. So that apparently was the.
It is stunning. It is stunning and brave.
Truly stunning and brave. So I think there's a lot we could say about this. Just in line with the larger kind of bizarro awakening theme that I keep hammering away at. In relation to the various kind of brands that leaned into all kinds of progressive messaging over the past decade. And again, there is a kind of Californian ideology thread because. What is the significance of frying in tallow? Well, it's that tallow is not seed oils, and seed oils are evil. They're artificial. They're this kind of this incredibly destructive element that has sort of distorted our diets. And this is one of these things where all of these kind of diet. I have no I think the evidence, as for most of these types of things, is pretty weak. But I won't make a pronouncement. I will only say that culturally it's again notable to see this kind of very kind of Californian affinity for natural foods kind of migrating to the right. And that you have a fast food chain, trying to sell itself as, and it's worth thinking here of like, there are certain fast food chains, notably the somewhat similarly named Shake Shack, in New York City, right? Which, sort of is a fast food place that marketed itself to, perhaps the kind of people who would buy Teslas. So there is this kind of, there's that. There's also, Steak and Shake having, and I think you did some research into this, Matthew, but having kind of taken on this social media branding as sort of
my research
sort
consisted
of online right wing, culturally coded.
Yeah, my research consisted of going on Blue Sky and seeing that the Blue Sky libs were saying that Steak and Shake had gone full Nazi. I've eaten a Steak and Shake once, and it just seemed like this very unremarkable kind of middle American chain. And I said, well, what are these libs talking about? And then I looked at Steak and Shake's social media feed, and while the Blue Sky libs were characteristically overstating things, it was clear that somehow Steak and Shake has been marketing itself to and in the language of this online right. It's really interesting. I think accords with the writing you've been doing, Jeff, on the kind of mirroring between the online right and the kind of progressive left, because we saw, throughout the 2010s, the rise of this kind of progressive coded marketing, where things that maybe started out on Tumblr or in kind of more activist spaces were being referenced slyly by corporations as a way of showing, connection to youth or a certain, just a way of generating controversy and interest.
Now it's 4chan.
Yeah, and I haven't seen just what I think of as a normal, if by no means first tier American company doing this until now. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, just a few other things to add. I mean, the thing for me, the peak sort of Tumblr marketing moment was when Uber at some point, which, by the way, Uber now, after the election, co-hosted an event with X and, Barry Weiss is the Free Press. So clearly, and they sponsored this event, which was, if not kind of completely rah-rah MAGA, at least leaning in that direction. And again, co-sponsored it with Elon Musk's X. And so, Uber has clearly undergone its own metamorphosis, but really just a few years ago, they had this kind of very Tumblr-y marketing campaign, which was something along the lines of like, if you tolerate racism, delete our app or something like that. And, this seemed to be kind of the peak of that moment. But as far as the Steak and Shake phenomenon goes, it's also that there seems to be, and I actually wrote to an acquaintance of mine named Nathan Alabach, who's actually a practicing sort of digital marketer who's managed social media for a number of companies. And interestingly, he was involved in the extremely viral Steakum Twitter account, which at a certain point had a very large traction. So there's something about steak.
I have no idea what you're talking about. What is a Steakum? But
Steakum, it doesn't really matter. It's a company that sells frozen steaks. But the point is that they got a lot of traction by kind of attaching themselves to this weird Twitter enclave and sort of aesthetics. And so there seems to be this thing whereby companies will, market themselves in part by kind of adopting the messaging and aesthetics of a particular online niche. And so that's I think part of what's going on here. And as this online niche becomes more, as the sort of online right becomes more culturally hegemonic, it is not surprising to see companies attempting to direct their marketing in that direction, much as they did with various progressive niches in the 2010s.
And with that, thank you, Jeff. Thanks, Ashley. Thanks as well to our producer, Stephen Adubato. For more, go to compactmag.com/subscribe.